I'm Victoria Holt. I run the Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, and I'm delighted that we will be having the Obenshain Family Great Issues Lecture this evening. I would actually say discussion on a diplomat's role, arms control and nuclear weapons policy, how to tackle AI, space, and new technology. And from my chat already with our guest and with our colleague, Professor Daryl Press, I think it's going to be a very lively and engaging discussion. This event is part of the Initiative for Global Security, which is really dedicated to bringing up great issues of the day, as well as to the founding name, John Sloan Dickey, who was an earlier president of Dartmouth. And what he's famous for is saying that the great issues of the world and the problems we face in the world are really problems that Dartmouth can help understand, but also to solve. And there's nothing that better humans cannot address. And by that, he meant both learning and knowledge and understanding what tools we need as a community to think about these great problems, but also to do something about that with reasoning and analysis and engagement. So I think that is very much the spirit of tonight's conversation. I also want to thank Penny and Bill Obenshain, who have endowed the Obenshain Great Issues program, for their generosity. Bill chaired the Dickey Center board for nearly a decade and would normally be here, and he's a wonderful supporter of such dialogues and these kinds of conversations. In fact, some of our earlier speakers have ranged from former Foreign Minister Margot Wallström of Sweden, Hannah Tedda, the diplomat for the UN, who runs the Horn of Africa strategies and was Foreign Minister of Ghana. We've also had Hillary Clinton in conversation with Jake Sullivan. So it's enabled us to have a wide range of topics. But I don't think we've talked about nuclear weapons, arms control, new technology, and modern war in the same way that we will this evening. So let me briefly turn to our two primary conversationalists here. First, I'm really delighted that Mallory Stewart made it from Washington to join us today. She has just finished serving as Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability at the U.S. Department of State during the Biden administration. She also served in a similar role at the White House, where she was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Arms Control, Disarmament, and Nonproliferation. She's also been a Senior Manager for Global Nuclear Security and Nonproliferation at the Center for Global Security and Cooperation at Sandia National Laboratory. Previously, she's been in government for quite a bit of her career. She served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges and Defense Policy in the Arms Control Bureau, and was also an attorney in the Department of State with a great deal of expertise in the Office of Legal Advisors. So you can ask her a lot of legal questions as well as policy questions. She's had affiliations with the Stimson Center, with the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and has also been a serving lawyer before she shifted careers, and I'll let her tell you more about that later. I'm also delighted that Professor Daryl Press has joined us today. He's already very well known here at Dartmouth as one of the faculty in the Department of Government, and also to us as the faculty director for the Initiative for Global Security. His research and teaching focuses on U.S. foreign policy, deterrence, and the future of warfare. He's published a great deal. I'll just mention two books, Calculating Credibility, as in 2005, and The Myth of the Nuclear Revolution. We should probe this in 2020. I also know him as an author both in academic journals and in more popular press. So whether you're looking at the American Political Review, Security Studies, or International Security, you can also flip to Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and the Atlantic. So he's sort of multilingual in the way that he writes and communicates ideas and his expertise. He's also created something called Strategic Forces Bootcamp. You should ask him afterwards about this, in partnership with Sandia National Labs to look at many of these issues in real time. So both of our guests tonight have deep academic and knowledge, and they also both have been involved in policy and governance, and they don't agree with each other on everything, which is why we're having the conversation. So please help me welcome our two speakers. Well, thank you both for joining us today. This is not a light topic, so let me start with some basic question. Should we be worried about nuclear war? Is that a yes, Mallory?
I don't think it's ever a good idea to not worry about something as significant as nuclear war. Yes, we should be worried about it. Does it need to fill every moment of our lives? Maybe not, but I think it's something that we shouldn't lose sight of, and it's something that I think we need people thinking about in the US government and in the majority of governments in the world on a daily basis.
All right. Daryl, would you disagree?
No, I wouldn't. When I've talked to students often here at Dartmouth about this, I would say with, I think, complete sincerity that during the Cold War, what you needed to know about nuclear deterrence could fit on a 3x5 index card or something like this. The weapons are really destructive. There are an awful lot of them. They make winning a war against a nuclear armed state almost impossible. And therefore, it's good news, bad news. Probably won't have a war, but if you do, it's a catastrophe. And I would say that in the years since the end of the Cold War and where we stand today, everything has changed. We're entering an era in which we're entering a tripolar major nuclear competition, which causes challenges. We're entering an era with incredibly rapid technological change. And many of those technologies that are changing specifically undercut the foundations of deterrence in really interesting ways. And then lastly, we have this problem that we never really fully confronted in the Cold War, which is this problem of what I would call wartime deterrence. Meaning, how do you simultaneously engage in a high-end conventional war with an adversary, let's say, imagine over Taiwan, God forbid, and be smashing each other's conventional forces and trying to bend each other to your political will, and at the same time convince each other to keep your most powerful weapons holstered. And we don't even have the bad theories yet about how to do it, meaning the theories that are wrong, let alone work through really careful understandings and match them up carefully with empirical analysis. So the overall answer is, yes, it's worrisome, but it's great news for students because there's tons and tons of work to be done, whether you're a political science major, an econ major, or a CS major, tons and tons to do.
Well, thanks so much. So maybe in both areas, I think when people think about nuclear conflict, there's two kind of popularly understood scenarios. One, it's an accident. And some of us have seen movies where a flock of birds sets off a warning system and somebody in a submarine has to make a decision about that's real or not. That's accidental launch, accidental. There's also, and Daryl, you just touched on this, potential escalation because you already have a conflict, maybe starting conventionally, and the escalation can turn to use of nuclear weapons. There's a lot of space in between. So Mallory, maybe start with you. Part of your responsibility was thinking about how to reduce such risk of either scenario, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. So maybe sketch out for us a little bit, what are the measures that not just the United States, but maybe international community use to try and prevent either accidental or conventional escalation when it's not desired?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex question because there's so many different ways that risk needs to be managed and could be managed, and it's across numerous, weapon systems, as Daryl mentioned, across numerous technologies. So, in the Arms Control Bureau, we looked at risk reduction as a whole from whatever angle we could address to minimize misunderstanding, miscalculation, and unintentional escalation. Did that mean we relied on legally binding agreements, right? In the chemical weapons convention arena, could we utilize the toolkit of that treaty to hold a country accountable for using chemical weapons or to highlight and transparently demonstrate that our entire stockpile had been destroyed? Could we do something to minimize instability and doubt with respect to the concerns about the United States stockpile or other countries' stockpile? That's just one example, but there's a whole gamut of treaties or norms that we could look to try to minimize misunderstanding, miscalculation, and unintentional escalation. Now, you add to it the modern technology development, the fact that we have emerging disruptive technologies that could either lead to massive misunderstanding through an intentionally placed deep fake of a tactical nuclear use, for example, in Ukraine. And you can imagine the widespread chaos that would result if it was a very good deep fake. Even if it was not so good a deep fake, we had an example last year or in 2023 of allegation of an attack on the Pentagon, and it wasn't even a deep fake. It was just a picture of a building on fire. And the stock market dipped, right? So there's an example of a rudimentary allegation of an attack on the US Pentagon, and it affected our economy in an unpredictable way. And so we have to look at risk across the board, not just from one perspective, one weapon system, one technology, and merge them and try to sort of do the best we can to address risk from all angles. And that's why we changed the name of the Bureau from Arms Control Verification and Compliance, which in my mind is just 3 ways of saying arms control, to Arms Control Deterrence, because deterrence is a form of risk reduction, ultimately both working together to try to seek some form of stability. But your question, I think, is difficult to answer because we really tried everything from the political declaration on the responsible use of AI by the military to normative development in the first committee of the UN to address direct descent, destructive anti-satellite tests, right? Anything that can reduce risks in that context, risks to the outer space environment, reduce misunderstanding, right? Responsible use of AI, but also the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the NPT, utilizing whatever tools we could to minimize misunderstanding and prevent the instability that results, especially during geopolitical tension.
Well, thank you. I think you've already gone to some of the more timely and technical issues, but maybe take you back a little bit. You know, a lot of people grew up thinking nuclear arms control was between the US and the former Soviet Union, and there were a number of negotiations over a number of missiles and warheads and trying to build in confidence-building measures to reduce accidental use. What can you talk about briefly? We have a relationship with Russia. There's something that's called New START. It may not be so new anymore, and if I understand it correctly, it may expire next year, and it puts a limit on the number of missiles or warheads that we have and they have. Mm-hmm. You've tried to work with Russia, is my understanding, and also with China, which has grown its nuclear capabilities, modernization. So I can't wait to talk about AI, but maybe just these basic arms control measures. How do you see either of those, or what was your effort with those 2 countries to build on arms control?
Yeah, the New START treaty was important. It was extended when the Biden administration first came in. It expires February of 2026. Capping our strategic arsenal at an equivalent level to the Russian strategic arsenal, 1,500, and really preventing the wide-scale, unrestrained arms race of nuclear weapons between us and Russia. We attempted to continue New START during the previous administration. Unfortunately, as we saw with numerous treaties, Russia pulled out of New START, and they alleged it was because of our support for Ukraine. They alleged it was because we weren't providing some type of transparency, but they pulled out of, and this is a little weedsy, they pulled out of our consultative mechanism. The New START treaty had a consultative mechanism for exactly the complaints that Russia had, so that both sides could talk about concerns or questions and address challenges that they saw to the treaty. They pulled out of that consultative mechanism and ultimately suspended the treaty as a whole. So in their suspension, they basically said, we're not going to engage with you anymore, we're not going to have conversations. But the good news is they say we won't exceed the caps, and the U.S. responded, nor will we if we can maintain confidence that both of us are complying, in a sense, with those caps. So it's now at this suspended, but there are certain limits that are still in place because neither country has decided to exceed the caps on our nuclear arsenal. The challenge is things are not going in the right direction right now. Maybe with this new administration, there is an opportunity to discuss why a limitation on arms racing is in both countries' interest, and maybe that's a conversation that could happen, but it has to happen soon because the treaty expires, again, February 2026, and it's not the kind of thing that you can just sort of re-up quickly. You have to renegotiate, you have to go back to Congress. It had a provision in the treaty for 1 extension. We have taken that 1 extension, so in 2026, we would have to go back for authorization.
Well, no, okay.
It's
Daryl, if I could come in and
sure.
Do you want to come on in this comment?
Sure.
Well, I just know that you've thought also about risk in a very practical way, and you've looked at how conventional war and the guarantees with alliances could actually lead to an escalation much more quickly than maybe at least the United States or other countries consider that. And you're known on many issues, but this includes insecurity on the Korean Peninsula and the relationship between South and North Korea. So I was just going to take you to that kind of risk, which is a different scenario than maybe what we have with Russia or China.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do want to say, so on the arms control question, I'm all for arms control agreements in the sense that I think Mallory meant them, which is either bilateral or multilateral agreements designed to find common interests where it exists to reduce through some verifiable process mutual risks. I think it makes a lot of sense. I always view these through two lenses. One is what's good for humanity. I have kids, I care, I'm invested in the future of the earth, but also what's interesting. And often those two things are pointing against each other. I think arms control is getting super important and way more interesting than any time in the past. And again, for some of the reasons that Mallory started to put her finger on, which is during the Cold War, when lots of our theories and concepts of arms control were created, the operating assumptions, which I think were largely true, was that arms control treaties which created symmetry, and arms control treaties which were verifiable, and arms control treaties which reduced numbers, basically served humanity's interests and the Soviet interest and the United States interest. The huge thing that's changing, which again I think makes things so interesting, is for a variety of technological reasons. We're entering an era, I believe, in which the key attributes which either makes a nuclear arsenal vulnerable or not, vulnerable to destruction or not, are based on some technical issues which are going to be very difficult to verify in any sort of standoff sense. It's not about counting warheads. It's not about counting missiles. And more interestingly, it's creating a world in which the normal arms control playbook shouldn't be thrown out, but needs to be reevaluated. It might be that we're entering a world in which giant, enormous arsenals that bankrupt us is a bad idea, but that actually small arsenals of nuclear weapons is a worse idea, or an equally bad idea. That small arsenals, whether they're deployed on submarines or on mobile missiles or whatever, might create the worst of all worlds, a world in which nuclear weapons exist, and yet various countries' arsenals are vulnerable. And so the old arms control playbook of let's come to agreements, let's bring arsenals in line with each other, let's reduce numbers, and let's verify, I think it made tons of sense for a few decades. But the actual logic of this might have to be reassessed in a real critical way.
All right, well, so do the principles apply? You know what, actually, let's hold on that. I want to go back to risk reduction questions.
Yeah.
You have posited a scenario where we're marrying up the old scenario of conventional war on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. would back South Korea. And you've argued that because North Korea's capability to potentially strike the United States with nuclear war, therefore has led to insecurity of that defense agreement. And so you probe the idea that maybe not all proliferation is bad, and that indeed maybe South Korea needs to consider their own nuclear capabilities for this larger question of stability, which would indeed require them to pull out of the Nonproliferation Treaty, which in general most people think arms control is a good thing. So before we go to the tech, let's stick with the kind of conventional nuclear relationship. Could you just explain a little bit of your thinking on that? And then Mallory, I'll turn to you for a diplomat's point of view.
I'm going to be a broken record. I'm going to be saying the same thing over and over again, which is it used to be simpler and now it's harder. And so again, I think America's non-proliferation policy for several decades has been wise. And it's led us to a better world with respect to the spread of nuclear weapons than we had any reason to expect in 1960. I don't think, in general, the spread of nuclear weapons leads on net to a safer world. However, I think we're beyond the point where it is either ethical or strategically sound, either of those things, to have what I would call kind of a one-size-fits-all non-proliferation policy. And the one-size-fits-all non-proliferation policy says we're against proliferation, whether it's to an adversary of the United States like Iran, or whether it's to an ally of the United States like South Korea, we're against it. There are good reasons to be against it. But in certain circumstances, and South Korea is the flashing red light, in certain circumstances, an ally of the United States is so sufficiently threatened by an adversary of theirs' nuclear weapons, and the credibility of our ability to deter those threats are so questionable now that our efforts to kind of keep our allies from taking steps to protect themselves, I think it's not only, I think, in my opinion, strategically unwise, I think it's a bit ethically difficult to sustain as well. And so I think there are a handful of things that changed on the Korean Peninsula. The most significant one being the one that you talked about, which was North Korea is getting the ability to threaten the US homeland as well, which raises questions about, in a war, is it really the case that we'd be willing to throw the survival of the United States onto the table, go all in? And do we really think North Korea will expect that? And if not, then maybe it would be good for deterrence and good for the survival of South Korea if they developed it for themselves. You throw on top of this the uncertainties with a new American administration, which many people think is less reliable. And in fact, the new American administration has already said in the first term they were very skeptical about the US-South Korean relationship. So, but the overall point is I don't think we should have a one-size-fits-all. I think there are allies of the United States, particularly ones who are democratic and good members of the international system and follow international law. And when they say, hey, I want a nuclear deterrent to deal with my problems like you, the United States, have, I think we should reevaluate whether our answer should be no.
So, well, thank you. And so, Mallory, you know, the U.S. government across many administrations has been very concerned with North Korea and DPRK's nuclear capabilities. And there's been 15, 20 years worth of sanctions, many approved through the UN Security Council, which meant including China and Russia initially supporting this. And that was intentional to probably solve what Daryl's laying out, which is growing capabilities. That feels like it's unwound a bit. And yet I'm looking to you for how would you answer this question? How would you reassure South Korea, or what would the strategy be to reduce the potential for this turning into a larger war?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am sympathetic to the massive threat that South Korea faces. The fact that the society has become stoic in the face of missile tests so frequently that it's just become sort of everyday occurrence these days that DPRK is testing an extremely threatening capacity over their territory, near their waters, or in some way even rattling chains by talking about the hellfire and flames of death that they will rain down on Seoul. So yes, they are subjected to a situation that nobody wants to be in, absolutely. But you know, and I also agree in general with the principle that one size fits all is not a good way to approach problems, right? Just to take a step back. As a twin, I feel it personally because very different than my sister, and yet people can't tell us apart. So I feel like there's never a good answer if you say one size fits all. But in this instance, I think I would say there are numerous reasons, not just legal reasons, which I'm particularly wedded to, but policy, economic, safety, military, and energy-related reasons for South Korea not to get an indigenous capability, or even to support a nuclear sharing arrangement where the U.S. would control and own the nuclear weapons and put them back on the peninsula. And I can walk through all those. One, I think it's a big deal that the NPT, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, requires all governments to be against proliferation, but especially those governments that have nuclear weapons. We have to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And we've taken a commitment in that legally binding treaty not to allow proliferation, and also to work toward a world in which we can diminish our reliance on nuclear weapons. If you don't agree with treaties, or if you think international law is diminishing, I can discuss that with you, and I understand the argument that many say international law is diminishing, and we've seen numerous treaties go away in the last few years, unfortunately. But it is in our interest to comply with treaties that support our collective risk reduction efforts, and the NPT requirements that we've committed to as a country should be adhered to so that we can maintain the legal strength of a treaty that's important to the international community. So just putting out there, I feel like I have to get my NPT stamp, and now I can move on to the other reasons. But the overarching question I would ask South Korea, I would ask any countries that's considering nuclear weapons, is what's going to be the result to your neighbors or to the countries that are that will respond, right? So presumably there will be a massive response in sanctions. Even if the U.S. allowed it and supported it, as you mentioned, there's been some change in the administration's thinking on this. Even if the U.S. did not join in UN Security Council resolutions that would sanction the withdrawal from the NPT, as we've seen sanctions applied to DPRK. Other countries would unilaterally sanction significantly. China, which responded with extreme unhappiness to the terminal high altitude area defense, the THAAD missile defense system that the US provided to South Korea, imposing sanctions, extremely upset that South Korea had this capacity now on its territory, and that was a missile defense system. China would essentially be deeply, deeply threatened by this. Not to say anything of the North Koreans, who of course, as we know, are already threatened by everything, right? Joint exercises with the US, joint exercises between the US and Japan, and the growing cooperation between ROK and Japan. So China and DPRK would be extraordinarily upset. ROK would be vulnerable when it's developing this program, not just to economic sanctions, but to actually preemptive strikes to try to take out any indigenous capabilities. The sort of strategic stability, such as it is, and it's, as I completely agree, it's very tenuous and it's extraordinarily threatening for the ROK, right now has been stable. And the idea that you would make that more stable by bringing in nuclear weapons to South Korea doesn't make sense to me. Additionally, I was mentioning there's many levels. South Korea is relying and is set to rely, I think, on 30% for its energy supply on civil nuclear energy. The ability to work in the civil space of nuclear energy would be highly diminished by sanctions, by countries saying...
Can you just explain that, what the relationship is?
So nuclear energy, of course, is a big, important source of reusable energy and renewable source. And you have to be an upstanding member of the NPT or the international community to be able to cooperate. You should be, and every country has said, if you are trusted to not, deviate from the norm of not developing nuclear weapons, then you can get civil nuclear energy. This is for non-nuclear weapon states. And there's agreements that we have, with the ROK, with numerous countries that says because you are an upstanding member, because, you believe in the rule of law and we trust you, we can work with you on nuclear energy, civil nuclear energy. And thus we can actually cooperate and facilitate this because you abide by laws, we abide by laws, it's in everyone's interest, and there isn't any insecurity about sort of utilizing this nuclear knowledge for weapon systems. That would all go away. Even if the US was okay with this development in ROK, the rest of the world would not be okay with this, and they would be even more upset. So those are just a few of the reasons, but I think there's numerous reasons for ROK to be thinking of this, and I think that's perfectly justified. The final sort of broad reason from the US perspective why I think we have been anti-proliferation for so long and why we must support our extended deterrence relationships is that our relationship with ROK isn't in a vacuum, right? If our very close extended deterrence partnership in Korea decides they don't trust our extended deterrence relationship, what does it say to Japan? What does it say to our NATO allies? All of these countries are going to be asked, why are we relying on Washington? Why don't we get our own indigenous capability, right? The whole structure of nuclear sharing that NATO was built upon, the whole structure of extended deterrence to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons will be shaken, if not ruined, if ROK says, we just don't trust you anymore. Because every country then would be asking the same question.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm sure you thought about this, Daryl.
Say it again.
I'm sure you've thought about this.
Yeah, no, this is great. Again, and Mallory and I've known each other before this, and it's a great articulation of a thoughtful U.S. position. I would say, which Mallory already knows, we've been through this before. We faced the same problem in the late 1950s with our European allies, most of which didn't have nuclear weapons, right? So the only NATO allies with nuclear weapons, other than the United States, is the United Kingdom and France. And the West Germans were saying in the late 1950s the exact same things that South Korea says today about their concerns about the reliability of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. And they said to us that they were going to get nuclear weapons for the same reason. And our answer to the West Germans was not tough, you just have to live with it, or you just need to believe us. Our answer to them was what you mentioned, NATO nuclear sharing. And in my mind, what I think we're seeing starting to happen now is not a South Korean rush to the bomb. They could have done that before. I don't think they're doing it now. But I think what we're seeing now is a negotiation where I would guess what's on South Korea's mind is to tell us, like the West Germans did. I call them West Germans because it was during the Cold War when they were West Germans. Tell us today what the West Germans did, which is we are sufficiently unsatisfied with the commitment that we have that we're going to have to move toward nuclear weapons, in hope that the US answer will be the answer that we gave NATO, which is let's have a deep NATO nuclear sharing agreement with actual weapons on the territory and bring you into planning and operations for the purpose of assuring you that you don't have to go independent yourself. And I think that's probably the goal line that the South Koreans secretly want to get to, or not so secretly, and I think that's a way of probably forestalling in an NPT consistent way the dynamics that we both see kind of unfolding.
Yeah, and I would just argue that in the previous administration, we definitely saw that, and we definitely saw the concern, and I think that is what resulted in the Washington Declaration and the Nuclear Consultative Group. These are two sort of new efforts to bring South Korea further into an understanding of our deep commitment, ironclad as it's often called, to our extended deterrence relationships, to bring in a greater understanding and appreciation for the challenges that the Japanese government is also facing and how we work with both of them in the Nuclear Consultative Group context and in our extended deterrence relationship, so that we have the EESCG and the EDD, everyone loves an acronym in the government. These are our extended deterrence dialogues. We were trying to more fulsomely explain how decision-making is made with respect to nuclear weapons, how it's the U.S. president's prerogative, and yet there's complete sharing of sort of the efforts, the expectations, the drilling, the practicing that we do with NATO. We also brought that over and made sure that the ROK government and the Japanese government also feel included in those contexts and concepts. I think things were moving in the right direction. I know there's, we talked about this earlier, there was a survey demonstrating a large portion of the ROK public had thought it was a good idea to get an indigenous capacity, and yet recent surveying and recent sort of efforts to analyze that had demonstrated that there was a sort of diminishment of that sort of, Victor Cha, Professor Cha did a really good sort of analysis of how the instinct to get nuclear weapons diminished when you talked about the international political consequences, when you talked about the danger of destabilizing the relationship with China, the challenge of demonstrating that you weren't a direct threat, and really making the North Koreans, be even less stable than they are right now. And I think once you explain the context or even the environmental consequences of having a nuclear program on your territory and the risk that you face, I mean, the South Korean community is very aware of the consequences of other nuclear challenges, even in the civil side. And I think once that awareness was raised, once the understanding that the U.S. commitment is extremely strong, and it's not just about Washington versus Seoul. It's about every government in our alliance, every government in our extended deterrence relationships, realizing that they have to be protected as much as Washington if any of our extended deterrence relationships are going to have credibility, and we need them to have credibility.
Right. Tell you what, I'm going to ask two more questions, and I'm going to look out to the audience. So, Mallory, I want to push you a little because we're talking about arms control, but I know the U.S. government has come into deep criticism by a wide range of member states who think that nuclear weapons should be banned. Mm-hmm. Is it called the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty?
Yep.
And this doesn't make a lot of news, but in addition to what you're describing in the region, talk a little bit about how the U.S. experiences that form of criticism from another point of view about being inconsistent with the NPT and not doing enough to diminish nuclear weapons as they already exist.
Yeah, and I will say, just to tie it a little bit into the previous conversation, the challenge the U.S. government, the British government, the French government face from the TPNW, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty crowd, is actually one of the reasons that our NATO alliance, some of them, are very quiet about our nuclear sharing arrangements, are very quiet about the fact that NATO relies on nuclear weapons to defend itself. And because there is a growing sentiment that all nuclear weapons are bad, which, of course...
Sentiment among whom?
So I mean, I think in a perfect world, I also have children, there would be no nuclear weapons. In a perfect world, there would be no nuclear weapons, but we have nuclear weapons now. So the growing sentiment is around a large portion of the NGO world, reflected sometimes across the board in religious documents and statements. It's a growing sentiment that nuclear weapons are bad. I think we all understand that sentiment. The challenge is when you have a treaty that says, lay down your weapons and open yourself up to verification from all these non-nuclear weapon states, and you're only really able to communicate with the communities that have active civil societies that are not controlled by authoritarian governments. So the U.S., England, and France are subjected to sort of a community that says you must get rid of your nuclear weapons. You may not have heard of it here. Their arguments have died down a little bit in the face of Russia's illegal and unnecessary continuing invasion of Ukraine. Because the argument there is, here is Russia with nuclear weapons, having said, and I think it was either Medvedev who said, nuclear weapon countries cannot lose wars. And that's the exact sentiment that I think drives the nuclear ban treaty people crazy, because that's essentially asserting if you have nuclear weapons, you can do whatever you want. And
that's paid attention to American history.
I know. That's what I answered. I was like, haven't we proven that wrong? But yeah, I mean, the problem is this community wants the U.S. and the UK and France to drop weapons in the face of an active and ongoing threat, even saber rattling by Russia, a huge and really opaque buildup in a nuclear weapons program by China, and it's just not realistic. The community that would give up nuclear weapons would feel so insecure without the ability to anticipate that Russia or China would give up their nuclear weapons, because neither of them are interested in this either. And it would, in terms of the Washington pendulum, it would swing the pendulum so strong to the insecurity and instability side that you would have a massive backlash. And it would be the end, certainly, of any administration that decided to drop its nuclear weapons in the face of essentially, Russia pointing its weapons at us. And you would probably not have a successful ability to argue for arms control going forward. So I think that is an extreme approach. I appreciate the motivation for it. I appreciate raising the conversation to maybe understand why we all do fundamentally think nuclear weapons are dangerous and inherently risky. And in a perfect world, they wouldn't exist. But the idea that we drop our weapons and give all our information about nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states, and really the fundamental flaw of the treaty, if I can get a little geeky for 1 second, and just a little legal for those of you guys who are thinking about law school, is that the treaty says nuclear weapon states are subjected to this standard, the additional protocol, which is above and beyond the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency's ability to just rely on the NPT. We have an additional protocol that gives us even more access and insight into your program for the nuclear weapon states. This treaty would say, but for the non-nuclear weapon states, right, including potentially Iran, that is still qualified under this treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, including those countries that have capacities that have either not taken them forward or have given them up in the past, you're not subjected to this higher standard. So basically, we're going to trust for all times going forward that nuclear weapon states at this very moment are going to be subjected to a higher level of verification, and non-nuclear weapon states will be subject to a lower level of nuclear weapons verification. So if they decide to develop nuclear weapons later, okay, well, maybe we just messed up on that double standard thing. Okay. I just think that's a horrible mistake.
Yeah. Thank you for that fulsome response. I promise one more question, I'll turn out. So Daryl, I want to kind of shift and ask you a slightly different question, which is this community is worried about potential nuclear war and is arguing for some sort of disarmament. Earlier, there's other scenarios that maybe the public's less tuned into. And there was a brief moment when Russia launched what could have been seen as an anti-satellite weapon where the Security Council met. But I think you're both aware, particularly you, there's a lot going on in space right now. And the future war, to quote one of you, will be fought in space. So let's shift briefly to that level of technology and instability and thinking that, does arms control or do we have a way to negotiate safety in space? Or is that the Wild West and it's going to be really challenging? Maybe tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, again, it's a really good question. It's a really interesting, complicated topic. And again, the core of the complexity here is space has always been seen as a domain that was at the root of nuclear deterrence, because it's space-based sensors that we use to detect launches of nuclear weapons. It's space-based sensors that we use to detect if nuclear weapons have actually detonated. It's space-based communication links that are the secure links that communicate between a presidential decision to use nuclear weapons and the actual execution. It's all over space. And so there was a notion throughout most of the latter decades of the Cold War that it would be best in the midst of a conventional war to leave space alone. I'm not going to mess with your space systems, don't mess with my space systems. And that's kind of how we thought about it for decades. Okay, one problem. All of conventional war now is integrated with space. The communications links between conventional forces, the guidance systems on aircraft and the munitions that they fire, the communications links, the ISR that picks targets and does battle damage assessment. It's all about space, conventional war, and therefore it's almost a certainty. There are no certainties. It's almost a certainty that if you have a serious conventional war, let's say between the United States and China, that both sides from the outset will aggressively target each other's space-based systems. Not as a nuclear step per se or necessarily, but just because like fighting a conventional war without attacking the other side's ability to use space, it's make-believe now, given where we are in conventional war. And so there's not a clear answer here. It definitely does scream for arms control if there's an arms control way of sorting this out. But just the reality we face is basically a war with a nuclear armed power, a war with a sophisticated country is going to involve at least them and probably us too attacking things at space. And so what we have to really be thinking about is how do we posture our nuclear weapons that we have, and how do we build detection and communication systems or all these sorts of things that accept that reality, that space is a battlefield now, like it or not, and still tries to disentangle that from threats to survivable nuclear deterrence systems. And that's, I think, really the challenge that we're facing. But again, the overall point here is it used to be really boring. That there was a simple playbook on how you do deterrence. And the rules were we all hate nuclear weapons exist. The good news is we can probably make nuclear war too terrible to fight. All these things are wide open and need serious analysis and smart analysis and young people who are not beholden to all the old answers, but who will look at these as alive questions to try to figure these out.
All right. Well, that is a fantastic transition into having a conversation with our audience, both those in the room and those online. So the floor is open. Who would like to kick off here? I see the gentleman and then Sophia in front of it. Hold on for the microphone so that those online can hear you.
Do you have them ID themselves? Like
What's that?
I'm Susan, I'm an undergraduate, or I'm
We don't usually require that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jack. So for you, your discussion was mostly about states and how states can really grapple with all of these issues. But I guess my question is for what happens and what are your thoughts on when nuclear weapons proliferate to non-state bodies and terrorist groups and of the such like similar groups?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question.
Well,
Mallory,
you solve
wanna
that
start?
problem.
Yeah. I mean, listen, terrorism is also a threat that like we can't sleep on, right? It's a constant threat. It's also a reason why we want to prevent proliferation between states, because the more people have nuclear weapons, the greater the risk of nuclear weapons being diverted into terrorist hands. So yes, that's a huge problem, and there's a very large group of people working on the counterterrorism challenges of nuclear weapons. I love your question also because it ties into a complication in the space arena where you no longer just have states operating, but now you have a massive amount of non-state actors, right? Commercial, scientific, really looking at the proliferated, satellite systems that we see going up every day from those big companies that we all know about, and I won't mention here. That is also a question. What if those guys decide to do something nefarious? And I think tying back to a comment that Daryl made that I love, which is it's ripe for arms control. It absolutely is, but not traditional arms control, like treaties and legally binding, because the evolution of the space environment right now, the technologies, what satellites can do, the capacities, even the players, is so much more complicated than just the traditional governments with their clear-cut satellite capacity. There's no way to define even what a weapon is in space when it's so ambiguous. So I'm sorry I jumped from your question to that. Your first question is very important. We have to make sure governments have control of their nuclear arsenals, and there's a lot of work that IAEA does and all governments are trying to do to maximize the security around their nuclear facilities, preventing any diversion, preventing any transportation complex and problems in transportation. And it's something every nuclear weapon state should be worried about. But I think your question becomes even more sort of interesting when you apply it to the space arena, or you apply it to another weapons arena, which is even more dual use or opaque than the concrete nuclear facility that we can keep an eye on. And that I think is a real challenge. And it's one of the reasons we need arms control mechanisms such as transparency, such as situational awareness, which I call arms control, but of course it's a tool of every arena. But being able to see what's happening both in space, on the ground, undersea, all of that is necessary to try to keep tabs on this. And I think if you see what's happening in the Baltic right now, or the Arctic arena, where folks are concerned about undersea cables, these questions are being asked daily. How do we see in these opaque arenas either state or non-state actors doing nefarious things?
I would only add really, really quickly that if you're worried about non-state actors getting nuclear weapons, and in my opinion, you should be focused on possession of nuclear weapons or proliferation of nuclear weapons to countries that don't have very stable governments. There are multiple ways that non-state actors get nuclear weapons, but in my opinion, the most likely is regime collapse. And if you made me make a list of the various reasons why I do have concerns about Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons if they went that route, the number one reason is not even the character or the positions of the Iranian government, which we could actually have an argument about. I'm no fan. But we could have an argument about their policy making. The number one reason would be there's all kinds of evidence that is a government, a country. We would not be shocked if it was overthrown internally. And I would say I would not be shocked. And I would just say the combination of a country getting nuclear weapons and then possibly entering a period of substantial instability and not maintaining complete control of their military forces, that's a big danger. And so that's...
Can I two-finger?
Please.
Just that this is a reason for the historic approach of the United States to be anti-proliferation across the board, because you can never predict which countries are going to be indefinitely stable or indefinitely sort of trustworthy.
We even had a coup attempt recently in South Korea.
I was not going to mention it, but yes.
But I would point out it's a peninsula that none of its neighbors would be in favor of.
That's a good concern about South Korea.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have a question over here with Sophia, who's 3 rows back. Thanks.
Hello. My question related to what you mentioned about Russia pulling, or not necessarily pulling out, but cutting communication ties with the U.S. as part of the New START program. And more broadly, how do you think deteriorating relationships between the U.S., say China, and Russia, and other countries that have nuclear powers currently, because I know communication is so important when trying to mitigate risk, how you see that growing, and then also in the context of protecting other countries in Europe when the U.S. seems increasingly isolationist?
Thanks very much. Is that I'll go first, smile?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love that question because I do think we hurt ourselves and we hurt global stability and security when we decide that we can't talk to our potential adversaries. We did learn that lesson in the Cold War. We did start the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which is based in the Arms Control Bureau at the State Department, where we have 24/7 communications with Russia and now 54 other countries. But it started in the Cold War with the USSR. It was so important when we hated each other to have a constant line of communication so that we don't have unintentional escalation and we don't have miscalculation. And it was in our interest, not because we communicated with them because we liked them, not because we engaged with them because we were somehow giving them something. And I think that's what we've sort of had challenges with in the last few years. Russia tried to use our desire to enforce and implement the New START Treaty against us. They wanted to use arms control, something that the U.S. government deeply cared about, as leverage to get us to stop supporting Ukraine, which was a non-starter. We wouldn't do that during the Biden administration. And I think that was their excuse for not engaging with us. We eventually got China to come to the table on risk reduction in November of 2023, and that was a good start. And subsequently, we've seen more military-to-military engagement with China. We've seen right, recently, before the end of the previous administration, we actually saw China and the US agree to have a human in the loop in strategic decision making, so not AI decisions with respect to nuclear weapons. We saw an ability to talk a little bit more broadly and engage in multilateral contexts, and I think we have to ramp that up. And so I agree, we have to engage. We have to communicate because it's in no one's interest. It is not, even if there was some way to say that we could help Ukraine win this war, even if we could, which we should, and we should continue to support. But even if we could say adamantly, Ukraine could win this war, there would still be a need to actually have some communication with Russia to prevent the misunderstanding and miscalculation that could result in unintentional escalation. And so I think engagement is something that we have let fall by the wayside, maybe not as a result of the US, but as a result of potentially Russia not wanting to engage with us or even China fully engaging with us on arms control. But I think it's something that we have to do and we should do more of.
I would just add, what's the way of saying this? And I'm not saying this to be provocative. I mean this. I mean this to my core, which is, we were talking earlier, so Mallory's a trained attorney, and she was saying that one of the important things that you learn to do as a lawyer is you always understand the argument from the other side's position and presumably the interests and the set of perspective. And she always does that in all her work, and I see that here too. I do find, I'm not talking about Mallory, I'm talking about just general discussions about Russia's behavior since the end of the Cold War. Even if you absolutely hate the invasion of Ukraine, as I do, and even if you think that their conduct in the war toward Ukraine and Ukrainian civilians has been appalling, and I do as well, I think if you want to understand Russia's positions toward arms control and nuclear weapons, you have to walk in their shoes just a little bit. Just a little bit. Doesn't mean that you have to be a friend of Putin, but you have to understand what the chessboard looks like from their standpoint. And the one thing I would just point out is when the Cold War ended, we had a series of arms control agreements and big arms reductions, and we lived up to our side, and I believe they largely lived up to their side. But a funny thing happened in the details. Is the Cold War was ending, we were celebrating the mutual victory, the avoidance of catastrophe, the Russian arsenal is shrinking as they don't have the money to pay for it. And we went through, between about 1990 and the present, about 3 or 4 very significant waves of vastly increasing the lethality and capability of our nuclear forces, which the Russians just didn't have the money to do. We went through an early 1990s vast improvement in the accuracy of US submarine-delivered weapons, which was just game-changing from the standpoint of nuclear deterrence for reasons we can talk about afterwards if you're interested in. We then 5 years ago did that again and made them far more accurate. We developed new pinpoint accurate dumb bombs off of stealthy aircraft with nuclear weapons on them, which we had never done before. We've been investing a ton in missile defense. We are the world leader in space-based sensing and underwater sensing. I'm under the impression, though I cannot prove it to you, that we still send things into Russian ports and harbors and poke around where their submarines are. And so I would just say is some of the Russian reaction, some of their skepticism to arms control, some of the sense that they're being surrounded and hounded and hunted might have to do with Vladimir Putin, might have to do with strands of Russian culture forged by waves of invasion from the West. And some of it might have to do with the fact that since 1990, we've been sharpening our nuclear capabilities in about 10 different ways and really having the consequence of neutralizing many of their capabilities. And it's profoundly felt in Moscow. So that doesn't mean that explains all of the Russian aggressiveness and frustration that we see today, but we do have to look a little bit at what we might be doing that's making it difficult to come to these agreements.
And just another 2 fingers, sorry. And I'm sorry, I talk too much about this stuff. It's very fun for me. Engaging with them is when we can understand what they're concerned about, and sometimes we'll be able to address it and sometimes we won't. But if we could address some of it and actually simmer some of the tension there and say, oh, that's so funny. You thought that thing that's floating around in space, you thought it was a weapon, but it's actually not. And we can tell you, then I'm talking about a different thing. Okay. Yeah, a different thing. Or you think we started this pandemic? Like we didn't, right? I mean, you could have conversations and show sort of what their concerns are and see if you can address them. And where you can address them, great. Where you can't address them, then you can talk about, are there transparency mechanisms that can get to a level of stability, even though you can't address the underlying concern.
Okay, fantastic. I've seen a bunch of hands. I think we'll first go over here to Maddie, and then we'll switch back to this side of the room.
Thanks. Carl Graffa, postdoc at Dickey. Thank you very much for this conversation. Really enlightening. I work a lot on space politics as well, and I'm concerned a little bit about some of the rhetoric happening in this discussion. It feels to me as if it's not always been the case that space has been associated with arms control or verification, right? There's a series of specific decisions made by humans, right, that led space to be treated in that way, right? So just that initial kind of pushback on the naturalization of the space domain as part of this whole equation, right? But now that we're living in the world where space is associated with all of these processes, how do we avoid securitization or territorialization of outer space that might increase risk in important ways, right? Under the Outer Space Treaty, we can't lay claim to regions of outer space, but it strikes me that there's no material difference between taking active measures to protect space assets and claiming places in outer space, right? So how do we protect the kind of specialness of space politics if we choose to engage in this kind of securitization? Thanks.
Do you want me to go? Step one, we have to go back 40 years, or maybe 80 years, or whatever. If we're thinking, we haven't seen. Maybe I'm forgetting. I can't think of a conventional war in which active operations, destructive operations in space happened. I can't remember that. Maybe I'm forgetting something. But I would just say, in terms of preparing space for war, it's not a future decision. Like, this is way in the rearview mirror. Again, everything the United States military does has space all over it. It's communication, it's pre-war intelligence, it's battle damage assessment, it's guidance systems. It's everything that makes things work go through space. And so preventing the militarization of space, maybe there was an opportunity to do that. I don't know. You might know, but that's rearview mirror. It's way past.
And I would just argue that everything in life right now, regardless of being military or not, is more and more reliant on space, right? For banking, for our iPhones, for our capacity to get from one place in the city to somewhere else,
Google Maps.
right? Yeah, exactly. For everything my teenage kids do, they require space more than they realize. So it's not just the military; we rely on it for almost everything. I would argue that's why we need risk reduction. And so, stepping back from legally binding treaties that most people think is arms control, I would say we need arms control that deals with norms and rules of responsible behavior, and so that we can minimize space debris, right? So we can allow the long-term sustainability of the space environment so that we can further utilize it. We could maximize our ability to agree on responsible behaviors so that we can hopefully deter, non or irresponsible or intentionally deviant behavior, and we can identify who's sort of playing by the rules. It becomes sort of, I know it's sort of cliche to equate it to maritime or transportation, but it becomes sort of an arena where you start defining rules of the road so that you can see where there's bad actors, and you can hopefully encourage everyone to do the right thing so that we can engage in this militarization and this competition, because everything is a competition these days, in a way that allows for less risk, less misunderstanding, less unintentional escalation, and just sheer competition, which is what we engage in all the time in all of these arenas. So we need some rules and guidance to prevent the lawlessness of what would otherwise be a crucial domain that we're not sure how to operate in.
Thank you. Great question. I see over here, I see Prescott, and then the gentleman on the corner, and then Sri, and then in back. We got 4. Okay, and 5, and 6. Excellent. Yeah. We can take a few.
This question is a little bit more directed towards Assistant Secretary Stewart. So yesterday, the Associated Press released an article about how the IDF has been using U.S.-made models inside of their combat operations. And I was curious, over your tenure at State, how did human rights considerations, particularly around civilian protection and human control over lethal decisions, influences the State Department's approach to AI-based arms control?
And by IDF, you mean the Israeli Defense Forces?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so Israel is a participating country in the 58 countries that signed on, I think they are, with our political declarations on the responsible use of AI. And And that's good. So that means that they've committed to use AI in their military systems in a manner consistent with international law, including all forms of international law. They've agreed to include, now these are all politically binding, I get that, but at least there's a commitment to try to adhere to these 10 principles in our political declaration that keep the use of AI from creating more risks, right? So it's make sure you use AI in a system that you understand. You don't have AI upon AI without understanding that it could add risk. There's inherent human bias. We all recognize that. Those are the 10 principles. You can find them on the State Department website. So they've committed to approach these topics from a responsible arena. And so we've talked with them, and I wasn't the one that was doing all the talking, but from the arms control perspective, we've engaged with them as to why it's beneficial to them to engage in this responsible behavior. So if there's individual technologies that were used, the commitment they made to us to even receive the technologies is to adhere to international law and have a commitment to responsible behavior. Now, are there uses that go either under the radar or that are not used appropriately? Probably, just as there's U.S. military equipment used all over the world, potentially not in the way it was intended to be used. But do we do our best to try to ensure that they're doing the responsible thing and they understand why they need to use it in that way? Absolutely, and that's where the State Department, it's actually the Political Military Bureau that actually enforces the relationship based on the equipment that demonstrates the recipient is going to use it in accordance with international law, with our own domestic requirements, and try to be responsible. The reports that you've heard, I think the Gaza conflict is very difficult. Obviously, we're seeing now a ceasefire being implemented, and that's good news. But there's a lot of questions that have to be asked. Could we have avoided something as much loss of human life? Was there a way to handle this better? It's really a hard question because underlying outrage at the initial October 7th attack was so extreme and reflected such an extreme amount of insecurity and instability in the region, and especially for Israel feeling that they were under attack for no reason. Of course, there's an argument there. So I think it's a broader question, but the U.S. government certainly has requirements on its military sales, on its provision of equipment that the recipient country is supposed to adhere to. It's a little bit outside of the arms control arena, it's the political military arena, but we are certainly involved in helping to define responsible behaviors in the use of that equipment.
Okay, thanks very much. The gentleman on the corner, and then Shri, if you had your hand up, we'll go there, and then back over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much for coming to speak today. My question is about the implications of a nuclear Iran. I feel like we've been hearing for years now that Iran is weeks or months away from having a nuclear weapon. Should Iran take the steps to actually build a nuclear weapon, what would be the reasons for doing so? And should Israel independently or would the United States fail to stop the Iran nuclear program, what would be the implications for the broader Middle East? Could we see countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia building their own indigenous nuclear capability?
Another great question. Daryl, do you want to take this one?
Well, I'll start. These are trillion-dollar questions, and there's so many of them. So, you asked the question about consequences. What would be the consequences for other countries in the region, and they're likely to follow or not? It's one of your questions. Another question was, you kind of asked if they've been 6 months away for 10 years, what does that mean, or 20 years? Let me kind of do those. I'm not trying to dodge any parts of the question. I didn't jot it down while you were speaking. On the timing question, the way I understood all those statements was where people were making estimates of how long it would take Iran to build a bomb after they had decided they're breaking out of their treaty commitments and doing so. And so they weren't saying on December 15th of 2010, Iran is 6 months away. They were saying, should Iran go forward now, that was how long they thought they would. And so people have debated these intervals, and I think the intervals have been kind of sloppy. But I think that the answer to the question on that is they're not very far away. That I go back and forth between saying Iran and Iran, and I don't know what the proper one, do you know which is? I'm not sure. Okay, will you stipulate Iran? Or?
I always say Iran, but I could be wrong.
I'm going to go for Iran.
Yeah.
So I think what we all need to know from a policy standpoint is the answer is not very long. That they've basically mastered all the important parts of the weaponization process, and they've even tested, I believe, unless you believe that Iran is getting seriously into the industrial diamond business, they've also tested the difficult stages of weaponizing fissile material. So I think that's the answer there. In terms of what are the consequences, the answer is nobody knows. And when I teach this in a class, what we do, we spend a couple days, maybe almost a day on Iran itself. We say, let's make a list of like the 7 different hypothesized negative consequences of Iran getting nuclear weapons. And then let's interrogate each of them and ask, is this a logical story? Is it a story that's also consistent either with the history of Iran's political behavior or the history of other proliferants' behavior once they acquired nuclear weapons? And in my opinion, the answer to those questions, nobody has the answer. Nobody knows. We've never seen Iran with nuclear weapons before. But I would say some of the alleged concerns of Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons, in my opinion, are probably overstated. I think the likelihood that a nuclear-armed Iran would decide to attack with nuclear weapons Israel is probably low. I think other risks, but not zero, and et cetera. I think the bigger risks are the concern I raised before, that Iran itself is not a very politically stable country. Whenever you see an authoritarian, totalitarian state that is permitting daily or weekly protests, anti-regime protests in the street, that's a state that has tenuous control over their political process. So I think those are dangers, which could lead to loose nukes. And then the third one being the one that you said. The only thing I'll say there, and I don't want to talk too long, I'm sorry. The only thing I'll say about spread is Saudi might follow by getting nuclear weapons. Turkey might follow by getting nuclear weapons. Other countries might as well. But I would say many times that countries are articulating those threats, they're doing it for their own bargaining and coercive reasons. And the main experience we have from the nuclear age is that when countries get nuclear weapons, it's never that their neighbors and rivals follow. Sometimes they do. India and Pakistan, kind of China and India. But more often than not, country A acquires nuclear weapons and countries B, C, D, E, and F around them do not. Because as Mallory described in the South Korea case, there are all kinds of costs of doing so. Think about all the Arab states who followed the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Basically, it was none. Think about all the countries in Southeast Asia who's followed so far the North Korean nuclear weapons program. It's basically been none to this point. So anyway, I would say it's worrisome. I'm principally worried about loose nukes following regime collapse. I think that the second-tier nuclear state spread problem is not zero, but it's not unsolvable. We've solved this in the past by coercing people not to acquire nuclear weapons. We've done it several times in the past, so I think that's the best you can do in terms of assessing it. I gave you time to think now and have a much more coherent answer.
We should do that
So
all
why don't
the
you
time.
back clean up?
And I've got one sentence answer. I'll be very quick.
But you've worked on this.
You got a one-sentence answer?
Yeah, and it's just that it should not just be a problem for Israel and the United States. And sometimes I worry, now I'm going to explain the one sentence, so I cheated a little bit. I worry that these problems in the international community, the U.S. runs in, and we will work on this, and you all should come with us, and everyone's like, okay, that's a you problem, right? This is a little bit, the Syria CW conflict was seen as a U.S.-Russia issue. I had other countries.
Explain CW.
Chemical weapons. So when the Assad regime used chemical weapons against its own people, that actually Tori and I worked on, so many other countries, when we kept pointing it out to them, be like, how are you okay with this? They're like, it's a you and Russia thing. You guys figure it out. That's outrageous. And I feel like with the Iran issue, so many times people are like, it's a you and Israel problem. You guys figure it out. There's not as much. I mean, now that's unfair to our closest allies who've been working with us in the IAEA very, very closely to try to address it. But a lot of other countries are just like, not a big deal. It is a big deal. This is why there should be no proliferation, because we don't know the consequences. It increases risk. There is a risk of follow-on countries in the region. Even if it's not as significant as some would say it is, there is a risk. And so the entire world should be caring about these issues. And yet I'm always amazed. I'm amazed, having now just left government, how few moments I had when other governments were like, oh yeah, and I'm, again, not talking about close allies, but other governments that feel unrelated to these conflicts, maybe even Gaza or Ukraine, they say, it's not really our issue. We're not really as worried. The fact that the world is so interconnected now, I mean, if COVID taught us anything, we're so interconnected that there cannot be a situation such as Iran getting nuclear weapons or ROK even deciding to go nuclear that doesn't impact everyone, and those countries should start getting involved. And so the more countries say, okay, you and the IAEA and and Israel, you can figure out this problem, that's really concerning to me. And I think that should be the moral of the story, which is everyone should be focused on it. And we should all say, give us some greater transparency because we're worried. And if you're thinking of going nuclear, let's talk. Let's talk about what we can do to prevent this.
All right, excellent. I'm conscious of time, and I see a bunch of hands. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand now. Oh, gosh. Okay, we're going to take a bunch. So over here, we'll do 3, and we'll do 4, and then over here we've got 2, right? And then I think we'll wrap up. So we'll do a bunch first, and then right here.
Hello. So my question was about the entire no first use policy. India has a no first use policy. And I was wondering if you could, in your opinion, assess the impact of the entire India's no first use policy on regional stability in the with relation to Pakistan or just in South Asia itself, and how specifically India and Pakistan can move beyond, and countries can move beyond purely a deterrence-based approach into a more cooperative approach to nuclear non-proliferation.
Fantastic. Okay, and then I think we're over here. Yeah, we're just going to take a few questions all at once.
The two of you have talked about missile defense a little bit, and I think that the opinion in the U.S. is that it's important to have some missile defense to defend from rogue states, for example, North Korea. But how do we balance missile defense from rogue states with the continued need for deterrence between China and Russia? Because they would be very concerned if we had credible defense capability.
Another excellent question. All right.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm interested in political polarization, and I'm just wondering is how polarized is nuclear policy? And I mean, you're on the Biden administration, and how much do you really see that changing and playing out now and in the coming weeks and months?
Excellent. Fantastic.
Thanks for letting all of us get our questions in. I want to know, is China winning the race towards successful integration of artificial generalized intelligence, and how does the successful integration of AGI change the balance of nuclear deterrence or a tripolar arms race?
Can you say what AGI is one more time?
Artificial generalized intelligence.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. I think we're going to start with those 4, and then over here you have a chance after we'll do... We could take a whole day to answer all those fantastic questions, so maybe just pick a few and ask and answer what you want. Who would like to go? No first use, Mallory?
Sure, I'll do no first use. And then,
I'll do missile defense.
yeah, and then polarization and AI, both of them I think are equally relevant, but happy to talk about both. I mean,
Right. Why don't you guys just start and see where it goes?
So the challenge we have with no first use is that there's varying levels of credibility or belief in these concepts, right? And so I'll take China's proposal of no first use. While they have a unlimited partnership with Russia, and Russia is saber rattling, and Russia, of course, is very proud of its first use capability. So the U.S. doesn't necessarily think that China's no first use is credible. Maybe it is credible, but if we somehow said now that we're going to go to no first use, why would they necessarily believe us, right? So putting ourselves in their shoes. With India, there's been some back and forth. We've heard some inconsistency with the no first use proposal. There's a very different relationship that India has with Pakistan in terms of conventional capabilities and dominance in certain arenas. And the no first use claim there sort of strikes, I think, differently than our use of a no first use assertion, which again nobody would believe and would highly destabilize our extended deterrence allies and numerous other relationships. So I think the idea of no first use, obviously there's some good sense to it. You're saying don't attack with nuclear weapons, and we are not planning on attacking you with nuclear weapons. Let's put nuclear weapons to the side for the moment and focus on conventional. I think there's an underlying sort of basis for a no first use argument. The challenge is when you actually put it into the real world in different contexts, and this is just like there's no one size fits all. In the Indian context, it may work because they have a stability based on their relationship with Pakistan. They have a stability in the arena with China based on conventional relationships, conventional forces, and sort of the stability that has been established. I think the no first use assertion of India probably helped when there was the mistaken launch of a nuclear-capable missile onto the territory of Pakistan. I think it hit a building, it didn't kill anyone, and there wasn't an immediate response, right? So it did probably help, and so there's some risk reduction there. They probably had a back-channel communication as well that probably helped. And so if it could work in a situation, if it's credible, if there's a way to prove to those that don't trust you that you actually can stand by it, there's something to be had. But I think in almost every other context, including in the China context, there's a limited ability to think when push comes to shove, when the conventional escalation gets to a point, or when there's extreme misunderstanding or miscalculation, that the no first use policy will hold. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And I think we are also unlikely ever to commit to something, given our political environment and our geopolitical environment, that would tie us to a nuclear policy that would be overturned depending on who is observing it.
I'm noticing these questions are so fantastic that we could blow way past our ending date. So, Daryl, I'm going to ask you to be a little short so we can get them all in and do one more round.
So my answer to question number 2 is no.
Missile.
There you are. Next question. No. Quick question on missile defense. The question, in a way, to rephrase it, is there a way to build a missile defense system that could protect the United States from, you called it a rogue state, a country with a small number of nuclear weapons like North Korea or in the future Iran, but not have that defense be so capable that it jeopardizes the retaliatory capabilities of a Russia or China and thereby causes an arms race? Is there a way to kind of square that circle or kind of do just right? Lots and lots of people will tell you there is. And I don't know if I want to say they're wrong or I want to say they're lying. And I never say that. I'm Mr. There's two sides of this debate, but there's not on this. Here's the trick they play. They say, look, we could build a system that could hopefully reliably intercept 25 weapons. That'll cover hopefully North Korean. But it's never going to cover the 200 growing up to 1,000 Chinese weapons. It's going to intercept 25. It's never going to cover the large Russian arsenal. And that's the trick. It's right-sizing it. But here's the problem. And this is just like nuclear deterrence 101, or even before that, is every country with nuclear weapons builds an arsenal that's designed to be able to, first, absorb an enemy's disarming attack, and subsequently retaliate. When China sees a lousy US missile defense capability that can only intercept 5, 6 weapons, it terrifies them, and they're not wrong. Because what they're worried about is not whether their current 250 weapons can get through. Of course they can. What they're worried about is, can their 3 surviving weapons get through after we've done whatever we've done to their arsenal? This is, whether you think that's an unreasonable reading of us or not, it's nuclear deterrence 1. And that's why even a thin missile defense capability scares the bejesus out of China and Russia, and is leading China right now, if you don't believe me, they're digging holes and filling these with missile silos as we speak, because they're very, very concerned about this. It's another way of saying it's one of the reasons why small nuclear arsenals, you might think it's a nice compromise. Pro-nuclear deterrence, global zero, let's just have small nuclear arsenals. Small nuclear arsenals might be the worst of all worlds, because you get into a situation where they exist.
A few more questions.
And they're vulnerable.
I can answer these two really quickly. Can I give it a try? Because I think polarization is terrible, and this community and all of the students that are interested in this area should try to prevent the polarization in the nuclear policy arena. We should all be working together to the common goal of national security. For AI, the best part and the worst part about arms racing is that there's really no clear winner or loser or defined arena in which we're racing. So China is probably beating us on some things, and we may be beating them on other things. And in the AI space, there's so many integrated different arenas in which you can be competing that it's really hard to answer that question, I think, coherently, and I definitely can't.
Okay.
You want to take the last 3?
Yes, I do.
Good.
So let's go to this side of the room, and I thought at least 2 or 3 hands. And Casey, I recognize that we have skipped over our online audience, so if there's one that is, burning a hole through the computer and you want to ask, please do. Okay, first here.
Hello,
Yeah.
also postdoc here. So I had a question for Daryl, which is kind of tied to what you just
Can
said.
you pull the microphone a little
Oh,
closer?
sorry.
Yeah.
So you talked earlier about how this new technology vaguely means that verification is very different and that counting missiles doesn't really matter anymore. I guess my question for you is what do you actually mean by that? Because when I think of what arms control did, 1,500, one nuke is enough, right? That's the catastrophe, is using it at all. And we know that 2 did a lot of damage. So I'm not sure the N is the issue. And to me, what arms control achieved is a lot of the things we were talking about, decreasing misperception, decreasing arms racing, thinking people are doing things out of different motives than they actually are. When we come into the room and say, listen, this is what we want for our defense, this is what you want for your defense, we leave it there, we're not trying to kill each other. So I'm curious about what you mean about why it's different now and why that's not still kind of the main goal of arms control, and what exactly new technology is doing to challenge verification and stuff like that, when to me, again, that's kind of the main mission. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay. We have Sophia.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, considering how heavily nuclear weapons rely on technology, and especially as that's becoming with AI and the whole conversation about space, how do we create norms and laws that are keeping up with the rapidly changing technologies?
Excellent, great. And did I see one more hand over there, or is there we're all set? Okay, all right. So why don't we finish off with those two? Daryl, do you want to start, and then Mallory will let you take it home on all, and maybe add any other final comments you want? Verification?
Sounds great. What I basically had in mind is one thing you said that I think we completely agree about is arms control is much broader than just numerical limits or numerical cuts. There's confidence building agreements. There's just kind of like political changes you cause by the fact that you're being involved in a cooperative exercise. There are rules of the game, deconfliction, communication procedures. There's a whole world of arms control, which I think definitely, at least seems to me, still has as much purpose as it used to. What I was trying to say is the old playbook, especially in the nuclear arms realm, on top of all those things, which I'd call soft arms control, though it might be very important, was kind of mutually verifiable reductions. And it was all premised, the calculations were done carefully. This was not done willy-nilly. And the underlying calculations done in all these agreements we made with then the Soviet Union and then following on with Russia was to leave each other with capabilities in both sides that were clearly and redundantly survivable. So nobody could, A, think they could win a nuclear war, and nobody, B, could believe their enemy was about to start one intentionally. Because you didn't want to reduce forces to the number where you had mutual vulnerability. That would be a catastrophe. The problem is all those calculations now, even by the really smart, very knowledgeable folks who are doing this for a living at places like CIA and on the joint staff, et cetera, they're all based, as they were then, but they're all based now on very difficult and, how do I say this? They're based on assumptions about things like accuracy and various intelligence things which are changing very, very rapidly. The survivability of the Chinese nuclear force today, or let me say the Russian. The survivability of the Russian nuclear force today is either a 0 or 1, depending on what you believe the United States is able to track with respect to deployed Russian submarines and mobile missiles. If our ability to track those things is high, they do not have a survivable retaliatory capability today. If our ability to do so is very low, they do. And that's a function of the fact that we're at lower numbers. And then, but I can tell you this, if we have two things, number one is if we have the capacity to do that right now, there's about 30 people in the United States who know it, because we're very, very careful about that. What I can also tell you is all the underlying technologies to make that possible are things that we are investing in very, very heavily, have for 50 years, and are working the problem hard. So that's what I mean when I say the technological changes and the resulting technological uncertainties create enormous dangers that well-meaning arms control deals by trying to get us closer to the objective of 0 and reducing us to smaller and smaller arsenals might produce a world in a variety of dyadic relationships in which they produce the thing they would least want to produce, which is conditions of mutual vulnerability.
Right.
Okay, and I will be hopefully fairly quick, though that's rare for me. So your question is a good one. In the emerging tech arena, we see technology evolving so quickly, and it results in an arms control system that has to respond carefully, right? So it almost slows us down. But what we've tried to do is because this technology is all very dual use, right? You can have AI for massive good. You can even have AI in the military for good that prevents the targeting of civilians, right? You can have space technology, as we discussed, that could be weaponized or could be amazingly important to prevent the next weather disaster. So what we've tried to do in the arms control arena is address it from responsible behavior approach, right? So then we spend our time, instead of defining treaties and legally binding, we try to define what we understand to be irresponsible behavior or irresponsible results from irresponsible behavior, right? So We all think space debris is bad, so we were able to get a norm with 155 other countries in the UN First Committee, which discusses these arms control concepts, to agree that intentionally creating debris through these anti-satellite tests was bad. It happened to be that in November of the prior year, Russia had done an ASAT test, so we could point to that, but of course, it all stems back to lots of ASAT testing from numerous countries. So if you think about AI and you think about space or undersea or even synthetic bio, if you can define the behavior behind the technology that we understand to be risky. So now we spend our time working with the international community to say, is there a consensus on what's risky, what is dangerous, what is irresponsible with respect to the underlying technology? So we don't use a treaty to ban that technology as we used to in traditional arms control. We used to say, this weapon is bad, let's ban it. Now we talk about using norms and politically binding so that they can be evolved quickly, right? Because political binding can be rapidly improved if needed, to say this behavior is not responsible, it results in dangerous, right? Creating debris is not responsible. Using synthetic bio to create something that could be proliferated as a pandemic is not responsible, right? Willy-nilly taking out satellites or impacting things that you don't know the consequences or taking out undersea cables, that's not responsible behavior. So we try to work with the international community to define what is responsible behavior. And then, if we can, we try to make these politically binding commitments like ASAT testing something that is remotely verifiable. We will see if someone launches an ASAT test at a satellite and it creates debris. That's amazing. That's verifiable in a non-legally binding context. So let's see how we can figure out how to shine a light on irresponsible behavior using situational awareness, using, again, we didn't get to disinformation, which is a pet of mine, but trying to prevent disinformation from eliminating attribution and accountability, trying to overcome that to get to underlying responsible behaviors we all agree are necessary, deterring irresponsible behaviors, but most importantly, holding accountable those that take those behaviors.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to just reflect briefly that you see in front of you two people who are both scholars, but also been involved in public policy and governance. And a note about me, it was my college education where we were having a very public conversation in the 1980s about nuclear war, the rivalry of the Soviet Union. And I went to a school where people were talking about this. So I hope we take the other thing you both said, which is all of us should be thinking about this and involving ourselves in it, being educated and being worried that these risks are higher than we are comfortable with and doing something about it. So please join me in thanking our fantastic guests.